In 2003, this movie was reviled by fans and critics alike. It's been nearly 20 years, and this week we're asking whether or not this movie was actually as bad as people were saying. It's a farewell to Sean Connery, and our final film to be evaluated for the pantheon for a number of months. Tonight we examine The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Welcome to the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
And women.
Eyes open, boy.
To save the world, Sean Connery must lead a team like the world has never seen.
It will be quite a hunt.
Why distract you?
She's out of your league.
On July 11th, discover an adventure
Mr. Spock.
in a league of its own. Sean Connery, Shane West, Peter Wilson.
Did you see that?
The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Rated PG-13. July 11th, only in theaters.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast. We take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at The Real World are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so by following us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. So Brian, this is a bit of a, you have a bit of a hint, but I need to ask this question of you before we get into the movie itself. What do Micheal Jordan, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and Sean Connery all have in common, Brian?
Are you telling me that they all retired in the same year?
Micheal Jordan's last professional basketball game was April 16th, 2003. Stone Cold Steve Austin's last professional wrestling match was 3 weeks earlier on March 30th, 2003. And Sean Connery's last movie opened July 11th, 2003. So not just in the same calendar year, but within a matter of the first, 4 or 5 months, these three legends all retired.
Yeah, at the time we didn't even realize it. I mean, yeah, Sean Connery, that was getting to that, but with the Austin thing, yeah, that was weird timing with everything. Now that I think about it, 2003 was a really end of an era kind of year, and then 2 years later we're gonna get Batman Begins to kind of reignite the superhero genre a little bit. But this was kind of towards that tail end of like that era of the early 90s, late 90s era of, superhero movies and stuff like that. So this is definitely a transition era. You can see why they made the changes to the script compared to the original graphic novel, which I actually read years later, Volume 1, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And you can tell, like, they really tried to Americanize this to make it profitable. But it backfired. It definitely backfired. But I don't know. I think at 13, 14 years old when I saw this movie in theaters, thinking, not much of it at all, I kind of enjoyed it. And I enjoyed it now. But I enjoyed it more for the practical effects, less the CGI in this movie. But I also enjoyed the costumes and the performances. So there's some good stuff to this movie. It's just a really shitty script, which is unfortunate because the guy who wrote the script is a comic book writer who's kind of like not a legendary comic book writer, but more like an upper card comic book writer from the 2000s. So it's kind of unfortunate that they try to, kind of try to compromise with the American audience in this. But I think they just should have stuck to their guns. Like the original comic is very dark and gritty and very British and European. I think they should have just stuck with that and instead of trying to Americanize it.
I think so. I remember not liking this movie in 2003, and I walked into this second viewing. I have not seen this since 2003, because why would I? I went into this thinking this might be a contender for the pile of shame, and I have to say that in watching it, it is definitely not pile of shame worthy. So I do have some positive things to say about it. I don't think the movie is necessarily good because I think there are enough elements to the film that don't make it so. But this was honestly a much better viewing experience than I was dreading. I think there are some entertaining parts. I think there are some good action sequences. And one of the reasons that I think you get some good action sequences is because you have the director of the first Blade movie, Stephen Norrington. And it's fascinating to see Stephen Norrington's career. He basically did 3 movies, and this was the third and final of those movies. And Stephen Norrington apparently had such a hard time with this movie that he announced he would never direct a movie again. And as we sit here in May of 2021, he has not directed a film since. And I think it's kind of unfortunate, because I think that for all of the faults that this movie has, I don't think the direction is necessarily the issue here. And I can point to some things and explain why. So one of the things about Stephen Norrington is that he did not get along with Sean Connery, Sir Sean Connery. I think that when we go over some of these notes, I think we are going to kind of highlight some of the best and worst aspects of his career. So Sean Connery was originally offered roles in both The Matrix. I'm not sure if it was The Matrix or if it was the Matrix sequels, but he was also apparently offered Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. He did not understand either one of those scripts, and thus he turned all of those movies down. And when he was offered this one, another screenplay he didn't quite get, he took it because he probably saw the success of those Matrix and Lord of the Rings films, and decided that he wanted a piece of the pie. Brian, I can't imagine a scenario where Sean Connery as Gandalf is good.
Yeah, he's more Sauron. But the thing with the Matrix is that what I read is that he was supposed to be the architect in Reloaded, which makes total sense because he's like the Scottish, English, what do you call him? The KFC guy, Colonel Sanders. So that's why the guy in Matrix Reloaded looked like Colonel Sanders, because he was a replacement for Sean Connery, who is like a European version of Colonel Sanders. So that was really interesting when I read that, because I was like, that makes total sense now why they had a guy look like Colonel Sanders in Matrix Reloaded as the architect. But definitely he's Sauron. Like, as much as Christopher Lee is awesome as an evil mustache twirling villain in like a fantasy setting, I honestly think that maybe Sean Connery might have been a little more grittier and darker, and would have been even more of like a terrifying Sauron, because I feel like we're so used to seeing Sean Connery as the nice badass, but imagine him as like a cynical, dark, gritty badass with magical powers. I think I'd be down for that.
So, in addition, Sean Connery had apparently fallen out of love with modern filmmaking at this point, and while he made no official announcement at this time, he insisted that he was officially retired. There were some rumors that he was perhaps going to make an appearance in one of the Daniel Craig James Bond movies, Skyfall, towards the end of the film. He did not. He did not do another live action movie after this, and basically his voiceover work was limited to television. So this is Sean Connery's last movie, and apparently there were a number of production delays and constant clashes between he and the director, which only contributed to some of the issues. And that's what happens when Sean Connery is making $17 million and he's not maybe understanding what the modern blockbuster looks like and how expensive it is, and how it helps to not be an asshole. But Sean Connery apparently just was that on the set, and he had apparently a really bad working relationship with Stephen Norrington, and they apparently disagreed over things, constantly changing setups. That's what Norrington was doing. A lot of shouting matches, a lot of fights, and yeah, just not a good working situation between those two. And I think it's kind of a sad ending for Sean Connery's career, but I think that you also look at, his behavior and like even some of the moments in this movie, because I mean we can't talk about Sean Connery and not talk about some of the comments that some of the rather awful comments that he's made about women and whatnot. And I think you even see that in this movie to an extent. So yes, he is James Bond, and yes, he is a legendary actor, but it's really important that we not try to Disneyfy his life And you have to acknowledge the warts, and you have to acknowledge when he's being kind of a dick and kind of an asshole, just like you acknowledge some of the legendary work that he's done in Hollywood.
For sure. And I'm a big Sean Connery fan. I've seen the Highlander movies, even Highlander 2, and all that stuff. I love The Rock, even with Nick Cage in it. But there is that history of him talking about the comments in particular. It's more about, I think it was like an interview in the 60s or 70s. He was like, it's okay to smack your wife around if she's talking too much or something like that. It was totally out of line and uncalled for. But, that old school mindset, being that old school guy, and yeah, it's an old school mindset, and we should always not use that as like a crutch, or, you know what I mean? Like, but for him to get out of that mindset, it was almost impossible by then. And you can see that kind of coming through in the way that he even treats Nina Harker in the movie, which I don't even think Alan Quartermain even treated Nina Harker like that in the comic, because Nina Harker was like the leader in the comic, and they switched it up just to make Sean Connery the leader in this one because of obviously all the money that he was being paid. But it's kind of unfortunate because I feel like The Rock was like 98. It's not that far off, and that was really successful. But I don't know the relationship he had on the set with the director on that one. But it's not that far off, and he did Finding Forrester really close to this one. So it's just really unfortunate that he had this really shitty relationship with Stephen Norrington on his last movie, because I felt like he still had the chops. You know what I mean? Like The Rock is not that far off, and that's a really good late 90s blockbuster movie, despite its flaws and issues with characters and stuff. But that's really entertaining, and he was so good in that. So it's just really unfortunate, and I would have liked that Bond cameo, and I felt like when I was watching Skyfall, something like that was coming, but I thought they were not going to obviously go with Sean Connery. But when I read that later on, I was like, there's no way he could have done that, because he was too old, and I don't think he cared enough. So it's just really unfortunate. But I think that would have been something else. But it would have been really hard to watch, because you can tell, like, at that point in 2012, Sean Connery, he probably couldn't have like delivered any lines or something like that, the same way. But yeah, he's got a legendary career, obviously, James Bond and all that. But you can't ignore the history. And there's still some like interesting like Sean Connery movies that I haven't seen yet. What's that one with Marion and Robin? I think it's like the older Marion and Robin. I've heard such good things about that movie. And there's some other stuff too that I'm probably not thinking of. I still haven't seen Zardoz, which is on my list of obscure B movies to watch. And I think you guys know what I'm talking about when it's him standing in that Speedo with a gun. Yeah, man, Sean Connery's done some crazy shit, but God bless him, because he takes a paycheck and just kind of smiles through it sometimes. But he'll definitely make the workday not pleasant if he's not really happy.
So in addition to Sean Connery, of course, this movie tries to make Shane West happen, and they are extremely unsuccessful. Shane West, of course, playing Tom Sawyer. The character of Tom Sawyer was added because the studio thought Americans wouldn't care about the movie without an American character and cast member. So that's why Shane West is in this movie. And Shane West apparently had his moments with Sean Connery and learning how to hold a gun. And Shane West apparently said that he was quite embarrassed because Sean Connery, who was 71 at the time, seemed to have no problem holding the solid wood and metal gun while firing a shot, while West, in his early 20s, found it incredibly heavy and strained to hold it while still aiming at the target. I really like that scene. I think it's one of the best scenes in the movie, the mentor-mentee kind of thing that they had going on. But really, it's only good because of Sean Connery's presence and Stephen Norrington's direction and kind of the way that he shoots it, and they really take their time to show what makes a good shot versus a bad shot. Shane West might as well be a broomstick in that scene. But yeah, I mean, I think that scene is really good for the reasons I just mentioned. But boy, is Shane West forgettable.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, man, because he did show up at PWG with another actor. I think it was one of the guys from those 90s Disney movies. I forget his name. Devon Sawa, I think he showed up with at PWG. So random connection there. But I think what happened was when they added this character, because like I said, Huck Finn is not in the comic. It's just like, I don't even think Dorian Gray's in the comic. I think it's just the five of them. Like Nemo, Invisible Man, Mina Harker, Quartermain, and then they added this stuff. But it sucks because like I know people, and I know this is gonna sound crazy and random, but do you remember the movie A Walk to Remember?
I am aware that movie exists, but I don't think I've seen a singular minute of it.
Well, for the drama heads back in the day who liked those teenage dramas back in high school, and had some friends that did, they remember that movie clearly, and it's like one of those like teeny cult movies from that era that has like lasted the test of time. And I think it's like I even talk to my buddy every now and then. He's like, dude, I just watched A Walk to Remember for like the 10th time. And I'm like, bro, what? From 2002? And he talks about Shane West and Mandy Moore and all that. I think there's something to that that kind of came from A Walk to Remember. It's me. This is me being conspiracy theory a little bit, but I don't know. That movie has like a weird cult following, and I think that's why they cast Shane West. And I think they figured, oh man, he was in that bit hit from last year. Let's put him in this one. So that's where I kind of think they got the idea from that. But at least he tried. But it was definitely like they were going for Indiana Jones Last Crusade kind of vibes. You know what I mean? Like they were trying to recreate that, like a young Indy. But because I just kept picturing, um, uh, what's his name? The guy that died at the beginning of Indiana Jones 3, River.
River Phoenix.
River Phoenix, and that's what that reminded me of. I don't know if that reminded you of that, but I was like, God, this feels like the River Phoenix from Indiana Jones, but interacting with the older dad. So I thought that was the kind of vibe they were going for, and they kind of set that up with the full. I mean, at least they paid it off at the end when he actually shoots Moriarty. So that was a good payoff, and that's not even in the comics. So I'm glad they added that to Americanize it, but it actually did kind of work in time in terms of like a story coming full circle.
For sure. And I think that when thinking about what makes this movie such a fascinating piece of history is, Stephen Norrington did not direct a movie after this. Sean Connery, this is kind of his last big budget movie. This is also the movie that Alan Moore, who was the original author of the graphic novel, he was so unhappy with this adaptation being different from his original story that this is why he distanced himself from all of the other movie and TV adaptations of his work since then. That includes V for Vendetta, that includes the 2009 and the 2019 Watchmen. So that's very interesting to me. Some original casting. Apparently, Monica Bellucci was originally cast as Mina Harker, but had to drop out due to schedule conflicts. I would be very interested to see what this movie looks like if Monica Bellucci is cast in it versus Peter Wilson. I don't know if it's any better or worse because the character, quite frankly, doesn't get a lot to do. But what do you remember? What are your Peter Wilson memories, Brian?
Well, thank you for asking because I did some research on this to make sure my memory was correct. I thought she was from Pacific Blue, the USA Network shows that were after Raw in the 90s. But she was on La Femme Nikita, and La Femme Nikita ran from 97 to 2001. So she is like the Attitude Era, like, she's like the Attitude Era star that was on the show after Raw every Raw. You know what I mean? So I thought that was kind of interesting because I was like, God, that's La Femme Nikita. But I for some reason I thought she was on Pacific Blue. I don't know, one of those shows, Silk Stockings. You know what I mean? Those USA shows. But man, it was just like wow, flashback. And then I remembered. But interesting that it was Monica Bellucci because again we talked about Matrix Reloaded. She was in that. But Monica Bellucci would have been a hell of a choice because Peter Wilson's good, but Monica Bellucci is like a step above I think in terms of acting. And that would have been really interesting considering that if they would have stuck to the original structure of the comic and made her the lead with Monica Bellucci as Mina Harker, I think you would have had some really interesting stuff there.
I think it would be remarkable to have seen Monica Bellucci just because I think she would have been a little bit different, maybe a little bit sultrier in a way. I think the only way that I've seen Peter Wilson outside of this movie is in commercials for La Femme Nikita that used to air during Monday Night Raw in the Attitude Era. Those are my memories of Peter Wilson. Commercials on the USA Network during Raw.
Yeah, and I can't even remember the run of Silk Stockings in Pacific Blue, but those were definitely the shows. I think there was a William Shatner show too, because I remember Shatner showing up on Raw promoting a show on USA, and then he gave Jerry Lawler a bump or something.
I mean, apparently William Shatner is one of those people that if you give him $50,000 to do anything, he'll do it. Like, he'll just show up to conventions and whatnot. So, I mean, I'm sure that he got that $50,000 and did quite well for himself. That's for sure. So apparently there was supposed to be a sequel to this movie, but the negative critical reception and the poor box office receipts basically meant that this would never happen. There have been some rumors of a possible reboot, but nothing has materialized as of yet. All these characters are in the public domain, so that is not necessarily going to be the issue. But let's get into kind of the meat and potatoes of the episode. Let's talk about the different categories. Of course, we start with heroes. And we start with Sean Connery as Alan Quartermain. It is his charisma that carries a large portion of this movie. But on the other hand, if we are to talk about him as a hero, we do have to talk about him as being a sexist asshole, because he refers to Peter Wilson's character at one point as a quote-unquote distraction. So that's really gross. On the positive side, I will say that I really like the action scene, the very first action scene of the entire movie, where Alan Quartermain is fighting off people with guns and whatnot. And the thing that I really liked about it is just how it was staged. It feels like action sequences these days in movies. It feels like there is an obsession with getting a lot of close-ups, a lot of shaky cam. And here, I could actually see everything that was going on. And I don't know, I guess because of something Kevin Feige mentioned a number of years ago about just being able to see everything and having almost all the action sequences take place during the day, I couldn't help but notice that this action sequence, like so many others in this movie, Brian, takes place during the daytime.
Yeah, it was actually like, if you've noticed it too, because this movie takes place in 1899, they have to do this natural lighting thing. And so if you look at it, it takes place during the day. It's shot in a big, like, mansion like house, but in like the living room kind of area or the dining area or whatever. And only the only lights that coming through are through the windows. So it's got this old lighting effect that really comes out nice, because I think if you do this nowadays, you'll probably put it on a green screen and do digital fake lighting that doesn't look nearly as good as real lighting, which is what Chloe Zhao is trying to bring back nowadays, the whole in the camera thing. So I think they really got that down in terms of the look and the lighting and stuff. Because like even the action sequences that take place at night, I still feel they're very well choreographed and really well thought out, and you can still see what's going on. Maybe some like really bad CGI here and there at the end, but even the night sequences with the action, they did well. But here at the beginning, yeah, they did a great job, because it sets up the whole Alan Quartermain character as a badass. Because the first time you see him, he's with a bunch of old people. You know what I mean? And it's just like, what are we doing here? This is like an old folks home, and that's kind of what they were trying to get you to think. It's kind of like a false sense of security, and then all of a sudden, Alan Quartermain is like, murdering people with. Did you remember that guy? He pierced a guy with a giant horn on the wall and just like left him there. That was gnarly.
Yeah, and I certainly think that just some of Sean Connery's snarky comments and kind of his approach to this, I think, makes the movie more entertaining. But on the one hand, I think that he is responsible for why this movie is not a complete and total disaster. Again, his charisma is so powerful. But one of the things that I always believe about movies like this is I do think that you need a Han Solo character. I think you need a character who is skeptical of the world, who's kind of like, this is all bullshit. Like, you get this in Star Wars with Han Solo, which is why I think a lot of Star Wars projects have faltered since, because they don't have a Han Solo. You even see this in The Matrix. Joey Pance's character specifically is kind of that guy who's just very skeptical. So, Sean Connery is very skeptical, and while that's entertaining, you can't have the leader of the group be the skeptical one, and that's kind of why the movie doesn't work, because while the performance is fine, he is basically not taking the situation seriously at all, and it's very hard to get invested in a movie like this when the purported lead of it doesn't care about the plot, or is not understanding of the plot, or is not invested in it. And yeah, that's kind of where I come down with my feelings of conflict on his performance.
Yeah, it's interesting, because like when you read the original comic, Mina Harker's the leader, and she's very much in charge, and Nemo is kind of like the tactician. But it's just weird, because like the first time in the comic you find Alan Quartermain, he's in like an opium den, drugged out of his mind, and like shoots a guy who attacks Mina, and then they have to drag him out of the opium den and throw him on the ship because he can't even walk. Like that's a totally different Alan Quartermain that they brought into the movie. So basically, they just made it around Sean Connery's like charisma instead of like actually translating the character from page to screen. You know what I mean? So that was a big issue, and yeah, it makes the movie palpable, but it makes the other characters lacking. You know what I mean? Because like it's clear if they would have just stuck with it and you had Mina as the leader, and then had to deal with this asshole, the dynamic would have been much better because at least she's like the leader. You know what I mean? So they did some questionable decisions, but again, that's all on Sean Connery, and that's what happens when you hire Sean Connery, I think. And then you're just going to get that, and that's why there was like that big clash with the director. I think Sean Connery just was just too big in his own head for this movie, and it's not what this movie needed. I think this movie needed to be more grounded, maybe a lesser known name than Sean Connery, but still like because look at some of these side characters, like the people that took these roles, they were still really good, and despite not having a big contract, and they were still really effective in their performance. So I don't know, it's give and take, but I feel like him being in it kind of was a detriment to the other characters. But that's again, it's a gamble when it comes to hiring a guy like Sean Connery. So it's unfortunate because when I read the comic later on, I really wanted that Alan Quartermain because that was a much more fascinating Alan Quartermain, a guy who's struggling with opium addiction and he's just tired of it all. And it's almost the same idea with the hunter and like his son and everything, but they just kind of glossied it over and kind of made it more palpable for an audience. But I think they should have done the more down and gritty version of Alan Quartermain.
For sure. I really don't have a lot to say about most of the other characters, just because I think they're pretty forgettable. Shane West is Tom Sawyer. I think he's a bore. I think the movie desperately wants him to be a mentee to Alan Quartermain. They desperately want him to be the one to lead the team in the potential sequels, and there's no there. And it's one of those things where I think you see where Shane West has gone, and certainly he has had a career, but he has not had the kind of career that this movie might lead you to believe that he's had. And we've talked about Indiana Jones. Like, this is kind of like what Indiana Jones was trying to do with Shia LaBeouf in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and it doesn't, like, sometimes it doesn't work. It really just doesn't work. And look, again, he has been on many TV shows since then. Funny enough, Shane West was actually in the new Nikita show, so there's a fun fact for you, Brian. But not really feeling it with him. I think Tony Karan as Skinner, I think he's fine. He's not really in the movie enough to make much of a difference. But I think that if you were to have the Alan Quartermain from the comic in this movie, then I think Skinner would seem a lot less redundant, because Skinner he's kind of a trickster, he's kind of snarky. I think that he is kind of redundant in this movie though, so he really doesn't have a lot to do, especially because there's also two invisible men. Jason Fleming as Dr. Jekyll / Mr. Hyde is completely forgettable, and that's kind of where I come down on it. There really isn't much to say. Peter Wilson, I think she's intriguing. I think she's good in the action scenes, but she doesn't get a whole lot to do, and her Sean Connery impression is hilariously bad. And the final hero character is Nasiruddin Shah as Captain Nemo. I think he's really good, but again, they don't give him anything to do. I think he is very good as the potential older member of the team. Not quite Charles Xavier, not quite Gandalf, but kind of somewhere in that ballpark. But again, he also doesn't get a whole lot to do because this movie is trying to introduce so many characters and they don't get to develop any of them. So where I come down ultimately, Brian, and you could talk about your thoughts on some of these actors as well, but I'm giving this a 4.
I'm gonna be a little more generous because I felt like, despite the lack of meat to work with, in the script, these actors did a really good job. Like, I think Jason Fleming, like, you've seen him before in other little things. Like, I remember him in a random movie called Rockstar, where he gets replaced by Mark Wahlberg as the lead singer of a band, this British band. He was good in that for the 10 minutes he was in that. He's been in other stuff too, but I thought he did a really good job. Like, the way that, well, I haven't really seen so many Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde movies, right? But I've seen Incredible Hulk, and the way that he kind of did the physical changes. Like that was really good because he was really getting into the physicality of the nature of like transformation. So I really liked his performance, despite him not having a whole lot to do. He kind of has an arc where he's kind of redeeming himself, but they don't really they don't really say what he did. But it's really, you look at Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, he murdered some innocent people, so they really don't want to get into that part. I get that, but he did have like this kind of redemption arc, so that was kind of interesting. I like Nemo a lot. I just felt like, I don't know, they could have done more with him. And looking at like the third time around, they had him do all these action stuff, like physical action stuff, like get thrown like 50 yards away and stuff like that. I was like, man, this dude was like 60 at the time, and they got away with that. So that was really cool. But just not a lot of meat on the dialogue. You know what I mean? So, and you mentioned lack of character development. This is like something that you could easily fix in a comic where you have the time to take to develop these characters like you should. But because of this, the 2 hour nature of a movie, you have to just kind of speed up that process. So anytime you have a team up like this, you're going to run into those issues. So it's unfortunate because a lot of these performances are really good. I like Peter Wilson a lot for what she brought to the table. I didn't realize there's all these little connections to literature back when I was watching it when I was 14. Now, yeah, everything makes sense. Like when they say Moriarty, I was like, Moriarty from like Sherlock Holmes? So like Sherlock Holmes is in this movie? But of course, they didn't get the rights to him at the time, and I don't think anyone's going to get his rights soon. But yeah, it's all connected in this universe, and I never really put it together. But I like that their performances is just the lack of like overall arcs and development. Except you gotta get that. You kind of got that arc with, like I said, Dr. Jekyll. But Shane West should not be in this movie at all. His character just doesn't work. I mean, it's cool that they did that relationship stuff. That really would be a nice little side story, but it's just too many characters, and you already had an extra character from the comic that wasn't there, so you're just asking for trouble. So it's unfortunate, but I'm gonna give it a 6 because I feel like the charisma from Sean Connery made it passable despite lowering the other characters in terms of ranking around him. But I did feel like the casting was really good despite the budget of the cast going mostly to Sean Connery. I felt like the people they did cast really fit the roles well. And they did a good job for what they were able to do.
All right, let's talk about the villains. For me, there really isn't a lot to talk about. This is where we discuss Stuart Townsend as Dorian Gray. I remember when I was in high school and I read the story of Dorian Gray, and it's a pretty fascinating story. And the way that it is rendered on screen here basically turns it into a cartoon. From the moment I saw Stuart Townsend, I'm like, he's gonna do a heel turn, and there is yet another Lord of the Rings connection because Stuart Townsend was intended to be Aragorn in the trilogy, and let me tell you, based on what I saw in this movie, Brian, that would have been a disastrous decision because Stuart Townsend in this movie is not very good, and I think he really hurts the movie, and I also think the M character, because they can't really make a decision on what they want M to be, the villain section of this movie is a disaster. And the way that he apparently decides to bring the team together for reasons, and the plan that he has intended basically to start a world war 20 years before the war officially started, it's basically nonsense. Like, it is complete and utter nonsense. Like, this is a society that is meant to be basically 20 to 30 years ahead of the actual, like, just the way that, technology was developed. Basically 20 to 30 years ahead of time. And I think that is an intriguing idea, but they don't really take it anywhere beyond just, oh, here are guns, here are recorders and things like that. It's kind of goofy.
Yeah, it sucks because once you kind of see it the second time around, it's obvious that Dorian like let the dudes in the house to shoot at the LXG members, right, in the middle of his own living room. Like, I don't know how these guys got in my house. I didn't invite them. Like, what? It's obvious you let them in. And then the whole thing with M, it's like it's one of those things where it's like they did the whole monologue thing, but they did it on a vinyl record. And I was like, oh my God, this is the worst part of the movie, man. They just monologued on a record. So I was like, why even send the record? Just fucking blow up the bombs, man. So, monologuing and that kind of thing when it comes to the villains, and they're violating all these rules, and it sucks. But I got to say, the guy who plays Moriarty, what's his name? I don't have his name in front of me, but like he's the bad guy from Moulin Rouge, and he was a real son of a bitch in Moulin Rouge. I don't know if you've seen Moulin Rouge, but he was like the most like toxic male son of a bitch in that movie. You know what I mean? So he's really good at being evil. And like I had no idea who Moriarty even was when I watched this movie. And now that I watch it now, I was like, holy shit, that's Moriarty from the Sherlock Holmes shit. So I thought that was really cool in retrospect, but they really didn't play into it because there's no Sherlock Holmes. But they did mention the Reichenbach Fall, which, you know, that's been one of those famous Sherlock Holmes stories over the years that's been reshot and redone. They even did it on the new BBC show with what's his name, with Doctor Strange. So I was like, I know that, and I think I know what he's referring to now. So that with that little detail, I was like, okay, so Moriarty survived the fall, took on this new persona, and now he's trying to like be a warlord. So that's what I kind of got from that, and I do get the idea of him bringing Quartermain and all them together because he needs Jekyll's blood. So the only person who could really hunt him down is the greatest hunter in the world, and that's Alan Quartermain. So that's the only thing that made sense to me. But then the idea, I guess, is he's either going to start a war or he's going to sell off all the vials and like DNA and like Nemo's plans and all that stuff to the highest bidder. So it's just kind of wacky because like, why even keep them alive in the first place? Just kill them and then take their blood afterward, right? Am I just crazy on that?
It's the Austin Powers problem. Austin Powers has basically broken these kinds of movies because of the things that they said and did, and basically making fun of the very thing that you just brought up. Why logically, why would you keep them alive?
And Austin Powers, like the trilogy came out already at this point. Like it stopped in 2002. This is 2003.
Right. Yes, that is correct. All three Austin Powers movies had come out by this point.
Which is nuts, and they still did the monologue on a fucking vinyl. That was the worst part. But for me, it's unfortunate because Stuart Townsend is like, I don't know. He should be just like one of those elves in the background kind of roles. You know what I mean? To just stay young and pretty forever, man, and just do that. But I think him as Aragorn would have been terrible because he's, even for Dorian Gray, he's too young to be Dorian Gray. You know what I mean? Dorian Gray's supposed to look young, but he's supposed to sound like an old man, and he does not sound like an old man. He just sounds like a rich, pretty boy still. So he didn't get that down at all. I'm going to go with a 3, and that's kind of being generous for this because it's unfortunate, man, because there's some real potential with that Moriarty character, but they just didn't do it right.
Absolutely. I'm giving this a 2. I think I've convinced myself that this is the one category that I would say is pile of shame worthy because, like, even M's accent changes throughout the movie for unexplained reasons. Yeah, this section is not good. The story is also kind of a mess, but I think that it's better. I think the building of the team is interesting, and I think the action scenes are good. And that is both part of the story and the technical category. However, the actual plot is nonsense, and it makes a little more sense now that you've explained it, Brian, but I still think it's generally too convoluted, and I think this is a problem with a lot of superhero movies. Even today, this is still kind of a problem, but especially for the 1990s and the early aughts, you get a lot of movies like this that just get so wrapped up in the plot and the twists. Like, I think to an extent, just tell the story. Like, at the end of the day, tell a story that is interesting and engaging and doesn't rely on the fact that, like, on the one hand, you're setting up Skinner to betray the team, but oh no, it's Dorian Gray instead. Like, there is a way to couch twists in a way that makes sense, but, like, don't just do it where you're setting up two of the characters who basically we have no idea about. You're basically setting them up as villains. Like, I think a movie like Iron Man, the first Iron Man from 2008, like, it's really, really obvious that Jeff Bridges was going to be a villain. Like, no two ways about it. That's the way. The movie didn't even try to pretend otherwise. So, something like that, it works because you basically know what you're getting in for. Here, you don't necessarily know because the movie doesn't really set it up that well. And it ends up being kind of a visual mess. And I think that's especially the second half of this movie. I think the first half is competent. I think there's some really interesting and engaging moments with Sean Connery's character. Even the gun scene that I mentioned, his first action scene, even the second action scene when they're in the room together and they're fighting. I think that scene also works. But you get to a lot of the stuff in the second half, and it kind of feels like one blob.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because, like I said, when it comes to team up movies, um, yeah, you really need to invest into like. It's hard to do the Avengers thing, and it's weird because like I couldn't help but think of the Avengers in terms of comparisons of the story structure. And Jerome, I know you probably haven't thought about this, but let me blow your mind for just a little bit, okay? So, as you know, in Avengers, they all had to come together. They all had to convince a person who transforms himself into a much bigger monstrous being to help join their side and convince them. The Avengers also had a red-headed woman who had to join the team and kind of lead the way and make sure these boys don't fuck up. They also had a an American come on the team who's really shouldn't be there, but he's this good old American boy that is trying to appeal to the American audience. And then you kind of got like a Nick Fury type character that kind of also joins the team, despite being old and being kind of unhappy about his position, but he's got to defend the world. So that's kind of where. Do you see where I'm going with this? Do you see where I'm kind of making that connection? Instead of like the helicarrier, they're in Nemo's ship, and like instead of like a technological genius in Iron Man, they have Nemo.
I think it's. I definitely was also making some of those same connections and the relationship between Nemo and Hulk. I'm sure this is something. I can't think of other movies that have done this, but I'm sure it's been done a million times besides these two.
It's just really like I couldn't help but think of that. You know what I mean? Because the whole idea of the Hulk and Doctor Jekyll is like the same movie or the same kind of character, and then you got the redheaded female, and then as soon it's weird too because as soon as I thought of that connection, I see Alan Quartermain pick up an axe just like Thor would pick up a hammer. So it's just weird.
Except Sean Connery is. I mean, Quartermain is much closer to Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man than anyone else, and Tom Sawyer is Captain America.
I just want to throw that out there. You never know, but I thought that was really interesting.
I mean, it's funny you mention that because I would make an argument as I'm watching the Nevers. I would say that is this movie probably is more influential on the Nevers than it even was on the Avengers. But we're not. But we're not talking about the Never. I mean, we might actually end up doing it. We'll see. But
I just found it fascinating. It's just so fascinating. But I'm going to give it a 5 because I like the basic idea of them, like this idea of the movie, but because of the taking the characters and adding characters that are not supposed to be there and not being a direct translation from the comic and not doing the tone from the comic, it takes it down a bunch. So I'm going to give it a 5. But I just wanted to point out those weird connections that I was like, this feels like I'm watching the Avengers.
the one thing I will say is, so I'm giving this a 4. But I basically agree with you that I think the premise of the movie is good, and I think this certainly has a lot of potential. I just think the issue it comes with when the rubber meets the road on the plot. That's where I think this movie just doesn't work. It kind of fails, and that sucks because I think there is some definite potential. So for me, the technical aspects of this movie, this is by far the strongest category. So I'm giving this a 7, Brian, and I think that, look, some of the CGI has not aged well, but I think the action scenes are very well shot, they're well framed, you can see everything. I like the first Quartermain fight scene, I like the guns that they use. I think this is a very well directed bad movie. I think Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, like, also for me, that is not a good movie, but it's very well directed. I think this is kind of in the same boat because when it comes down to it, I think a lot of the story elements and I think the script is bad. I think there are a lot of people who are woefully miscast in this movie. But I think that the way that this movie looks, I think it works. And I think for 2003, I think the CGI is fine for that time, even though it's a little bit janky now. I still think there are some very good visual elements. I think the movie is decently paced, even though again, I think it's kind of nonsense, but I do appreciate the fact the movie is an hour and 50 minutes. So they definitely had a good sense of keeping this under 2 hours, which is a good thing for this movie. So this is by far my high score. Again, a 7.
I'm going with the same score because I was just impressed with like practical effects, and this is 2003, so they really weren't going so full green screen yet, and they built a lot of these practical sets. And if you watch the beginning, they built a tank, like a real tank, and they just let it go through a bunch of walls, like real walls, in one shot, in one tracking shot. And I was like, God, this is so old school. Like, God, I miss this. So that was really refreshing. And then the costumes are like borderline amazing, I think. Like, I think the Nemo costume is so like well done with the color and the detail and the sword, all that stuff. And even like Nemo's crew, I love the design of Nemo's ship inside, all that stuff. The music is lacking though. There's like nothing memorable about the score. Other than that, yeah, the CGI gets a little wonky when it comes to the night shots, when it comes to like the Nautilus going around at night. And then some of the CGI on some of the effects at the end was a little wonky, but I did love the transformation scene. I love that scene a lot with Dr. Jekyll. I felt like that's very much an ode to American Werewolf in London, which I appreciate a lot, where you kind of show gradually and then have him in different forms of makeup as he gradually, goes down back to normal. I love that practical stuff in terms of makeup and stuff. So I thought they did that well. Even though that was probably part CGI, part makeup, I thought they really shot it well, and he brought that physical intensity you need to have when you're a Dr. Jekyll, Incredible Hulk. You know what I mean? You need to be like begging for air by the time you go back to normal as a human, because you feel like you just went through the ringer. You know what I mean? So I thought they did that really well. And then some of the sound design as well, I thought was really good, despite me not liking the fact that they monologued on that vinyl record. The idea of the vinyl record is that it has this little vibration sound in the background, in which you don't really listen to when you're the first time you watch the movie, but the second time you clearly hear it. So that really sticks out. And then I love the little detail of the sound of when they bring in Dr. Jekyll onto the ship, and he's going around the ship, and the only way you hear him is through the pipes. I thought that was really well done sound design. So I thought they did a good job as far as they could, except I think the music was just lacking really a lot. So I'm going to give it a 7 as well.
All right, the legacy. I had a tough time coming up with the legacy score, but the fact that this movie drove Sean Connery away from filmmaking, it drove Stephen Norrington away. I think it has essentially been forgotten and disowned, essentially. Like, I didn't even remember the 20th Century Fox is the studio that put this movie out, which is fascinating. Shane West never really became a giant star. Peter Wilson and Stuart Townsend, since this movie, have not really been in a lot of notable projects. So I think for all those reasons, and the fact that Alan Moore has essentially disowned adaptations of his own work, I am inclined to give this a pretty low score. Even though, like I said, I think it is kind of important for historical reasons, but those historical reasons are very bad. So I'm giving this a 3.
Yeah, that's where I'm at too. I'm going to give it a 3. I think in 2010 I might have given like a 5 or a 6, because I remember when FX was like really heavy in the rotation back in the day for me, and like FX has the movies. They would play this a lot, and I would watch it in the background sometimes, and it was playing a lot back then. But now, not as much. I think it's just kind of gotten lost in the shuffle with all the MCU content that's come out, and the DC, well, some DC content that kind of makes it look pale in comparison. So I think that's the issue, is that in 2008, 2009, we didn't have so much to compare it to, so it seemed more passable. Now it just seems like what could have been, you know what I mean? So the 3, I think, is very, very accurate and worth it. And it's I just hate to think that this was like Sean Connery's last movie, but it is what it is, and at least he went out with $17 million.
Yeah, certainly got a nice chunk of change before his retirement. Let's get into the burning questions, Brian. Our final set of burning questions. Total scores. Mine was a 21. Yours was? So total score 45. Again, I seriously thought this was possibly another contender for the Pile of Shame. The fact that it isn't is kind of a small victory. That does not mean this movie is good, because it's still a 45 out of 100, which isn't good, but this was far less painful than a lot of the movies that we've watched this month and in April.
Yeah, and I can easily see myself like a couple years from now just putting this on, if it's on TV, leaving it on the background kind of thing. Maybe even buying a Blu-ray version of it. I don't know. Just something about this look of this movie that really like intrigues my creativity. I think it's just that look. I forget what the term is, but it's that like industrial look, like late 1890s, early 1910s kind of look where we were on the verge of an industry. You know what I mean? And like the smokestacks. You know what I mean? Like another movie that this reminded me of, and that's actually connected to, is like From Hell with Johnny Depp, and that's actually like from Alan Moore as well, and it's got that same kind of feel. So I would actually recommend checking that out, even though a lot of people don't like that movie, and I haven't seen it in a long time. But I do love the look and feel of it. So there you go.
Would Sean Connery have made Lord of the Rings or the Matrix sequels better movies? Again, coming under the assumption for Lord of the Rings, he'd play Gandalf. So for me, that is a hell no. Ian McKellen is outstanding as Gandalf, and I literally cannot imagine anyone else playing that role. If he is the architect in the Matrix Reloaded, I am very intrigued by that idea. Again, he would be there for like one scene, interacting with Keanu Reeves. Just, he's a very charismatic person. I think getting across some of that nonsense would have been interesting. I'm going to say no to Lord of the Rings. I'm going to say maybe to The Matrix and him as the architect. I am very intrigued by the possibility, especially because they basically hired a Sean Connery impersonator to play the architect.
And it's not Colonel Sanders. So I would say if he was Sauron, yes. Gandalf, no. So that's kind of a mix on the Lord of the Rings. Any other role does not make sense at all. Matrix, yeah, architect for sure. For sure, I would definitely see him as that. But the thing is that the architect's not supposed to be charismatic. He's supposed to sound like monotone, I think, in theory. But if Connery did it, he would have just made it his own anyway. So,
would this movie have been better if they didn't try to make Shane West a thing? Absolutely. I think there is a very strong argument to put Captain Nemo and Peter Wilson's character in the leads. This is the only reason they did this is to get American audiences and to get teeny boppers into the theaters, and it did not work from a creative standpoint. It was just, he is very bland and boring, and he is probably the person I came across being most negative about after watching this.
Yeah, he's not good in this movie, and despite the one good scene and the arc that he gets, but I do think that it's just better off with the original comic and just leave him out, because it's not really meant to be Americanized anyway. The idea that like she is more English, European kind of style, he doesn't fit that.
What did Sean Connery do with his paycheck from this movie?
Okay, so he definitely bought a bunch of whiskey. I would say he's a whiskey guy. Well, no, what am I saying? He's martini shaken not stirred, right? Probably bought a lot of alcohol. Probably, knowing him, probably went to a strip club or two, and probably made some long distance phone calls. This was 2003, and maybe bought a compact computer.
A compact computer, you say?
Hey man, 2003, yeah.
I mean, this is the easiest one to answer. He retired with it because he never did a movie again, so he took his $17 million and just walked away. Stephen Norrington should have directed an MCU Phase 1 movie, right?
You know what? It feels like it. If you want to consider Blade like a pre-MCU, you know what I mean? Like maybe it does take place in the universe loosely. You never know if they wanted to make it that way. But yeah, he's definitely got that feel for that style. Like I mentioned, that early 2000s, late 90s comic book style that I think he got down. It's just, unfortunately, he just had to work with Sean Connery, who was not willing to work with him. So it sucks.
I would pay more money than probably is reasonable to get Wesley Snipes in an MCU movie, even if just for 5 minutes.
Well, the rumor that people want him to play the older mentor character. What's his name from Blade? I forget already.
Whistler?
Whistler, yeah, that would make sense. That would make a lot of sense.
The problem is that he is apparently very hard to work with, so I can't imagine a scenario where he gets hired for that reason, and it's kind of unfortunate. But look, if we're just going to get Wesley Snipes in all of Eddie Murphy's movies now, that I think is acceptable to me, because he is great in Dolomite Is My Name, and he is the best part of the awful Coming to America sequel. So this is a question that Brian was mentioning off air, is one that he really thought about. If you could put any character into the public domain for anyone to write stories or make movies about, who would it be?
Yeah, this is one of the tougher questions I've had in the last couple of days. I really wanted to think about this because that's a really intriguing question. Like, considering the history of public domain and what's, some of the historical things, like if you look at Night of the Living Dead and how quickly that became public domain and how many interpretations of that we get and re-releases and blah, blah, blah. So I thought my first initial pick was Godzilla. And I was like, God, so many people can do so many things with Godzilla. And then I realized, God, that'll just make more shitty Godzilla movies. I want good Godzilla movies. So I kind of put a kibosh on that. So these are the three names that I came up with that I think would be interesting. Okay. So number one, I'm going with Jackie Brown. Because I think you can do that character in so many different ways in so many different eras. And we saw Tarantino interpret that character in her like 50s, going through some shit. But I like that Jackie Brown character a lot. And you can kind of go back into her history and, you know what I mean? Like the 70s and 80s and kind of see where that character goes from. And all these different directors from, different eras. Like I would even see like, like a weird interpretation by Spike Lee, you know what I mean? In like a 90s version, just to see what it'd be like. You know what I mean? So I think Jackie Brown is a very intriguing character that a lot of interpretations can come from. Number two would be Michael Myers because, with the horror genre, and I mentioned Night of the Living Dead, I think the idea of a Halloween movie is very simple, right? But I think if you're a first-time director, kind of like the way John Carpenter was, that was like a second or third movie, like you can kind of find yourself in a movie like that where you find your style. So I feel like a movie that's got a simple plot, you can implement your style into it so much more so than with a complex script because you can with a complex script you can't really play a lot with it. With a script like Halloween, you can just like do so many interpretations of it and have it be so interesting. You know what I mean? My third pick, I wanted to make sure because this is superhero pantheon, Green Lantern, because I think Green Lantern there's so many different like variations of the Green Lantern from different time periods, right? From the 40s, even the 30s, I think, onward to today. You can do cosmic, you can do like neo, like like 50s style, like you can do all kinds of stuff with the Green Lantern character and the way that the ring can kind of just be whatever, and then you can just put it in different decades and stuff like that. It can be a male, female, whatever. Like there's so many different kinds of lanterns. I feel like the Green Lantern can be really like a really great sci-fi vehicle that you could use in different eras.
All right, so I'm going to go with Batman as my first one just because I think there are so many ways to interpret that character, and I want to see everybody's Batman movie and just what that would look like, different genders, different tones, like whether they're good or not is irrelevant to me. I just want to see interesting Batman movies because that character is so malleable and we've seen so many interpretations. I would love to see just name a random director. Like, give me Chloe Zhao's version of Batman that is just wearing a cowboy hat and walking through sunsets. Like, just give me all of that, and I will be a very happy individual. The other character that I want to see in the public domain, put the Muppets in the public domain because number one, Disney has no idea what to do with them anyway. And the other thing is, the Muppets are hilarious, and I would love to see what different people could come up with for the Muppets as characters, because I think that in going through the 5 seasons of the Muppet Show and watching so many of the Muppets movies, there is so much potential with those characters and the situations that you can put them through. And they're not being used by Disney at all right now, except for their crappy Disney Plus show, Muppets Now, I think it was called, and that show was not good. And I think there are ways to use the Muppets that are very interesting, and if there was some way we could get them into the public domain, I would desperately, desperately want to do that. So, the Muppets and Batman are my answer.
Very intriguing because Batman was my first choice, but I didn't want to like make it so odd because like that's like number one I think for a lot of people. But I wanted to make some interesting choices. But the Muppets, man, you got me thinking because to be honest, I think the best Muppets. I know it's like a little side tangent, but I think the best Muppets movie is the one with Charles Grodin and when they're in England, and that was so interesting because it was like a burglar plot, and they had some adult themes in it, and then they had like a love triangle going on and all these different things. I thought that was one of the more interesting interpretations, and I think I see where you're going with that. And maybe like, because I think the Muppet movies after that point were more family oriented and they didn't really try anything bold. To me, the Muppet Caper movie is like the most bold out of all of them.
I mean, it's either that one or Manhattan, I think, or Manhattan also makes some interesting choices as well. But then after that, once Jim Henson passes, the tone of the movies and what the Muppets are doing, it changes a little bit. And I'm not sure if that's something that, quite frankly, you can ever recapture. I think Jason Segel tried to do that in the 2011 movie, but I'm not sure how successful he's been, given where the Muppets are right now. And yeah, I think that's kind of where I stand. So that is it for us this week. There are 2 episodes left that we are going to be doing next week. So right now, the plan is we are going to review Jupiter's Legacy. As of this recording, there are no reviews for that movie or that TV show. So there is a distinct possibility that we may watch 1 or 2 episodes and not like it or be bored by it because it is a Netflix drama. And we reserve the right to either review something else, review additional things in addition to it, but we will figure that out before next week. In 2 weeks, we will have our episode where we are going to discuss our 10 favorite performances from superhero movies, and Brian and I are compiling our lists, and that will be it before we go on break. So for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.
Oh yeah, this movie even had the Hulk versus the Abomination at the end, which is, yeah, that's another foretelling of what to come.